Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending the webinar of TextSture and SustainIt. My name is Pamela from TextSture. And with me today to run the webinar with me is Joe from SustainIt.
And I'll take this opportunity to say hello as well.
So, just to give you a very brief introduction, first of all, for those of you who either can't hear us or have or would like us to repeat something or have a question, there's a chat window there, so you can let us know if you have a question. Just put it in the chat and we'll answer them at the end. If you've got a problem with sound, let us know now so that we know. And then we can tackle that. So thank you again for joining. A brief introduction about TextSture and SustainIt. So who is TextSture? TextSture is a strategy and innovation think tank specialized in specifically textiles and fashion and on sustainability in that. We work on two pillars, which are long and medium term scenarios. We do baselines, basically figuring out where you are just now and then figuring out from that how you can go to the future and address the scenarios that we will encounter in the industry in 10, 15, 20 years time, and underlining all that is research.
Okay, so now I get to talk about who SustainIt are. And we're a sustainability data consultancy. So what we focus very much on is the hard data of sustainability. And we help our clients to understand what kind of information they have access to. We help our clients understand how they can take control of that data through processes, through data implementation tools, or through dedicated software. And we help use that software in an engaging way. And that can be as simple as spreadsheet exports or as complicated as dedicated sustainability rooms with campaigns and posters talking about the kind of information they've got. What we want to do is we want to help our clients take sustainability out of just being something that's done in the background to being something that's part of their business. And for us, how we do that is we help them find and implement the right approach to sustainability data and sustainability reporting.
So what we would like to look at today and what this webinar is all about is looking at what consumers really expect from companies in terms of products and their sustainability credentials, looking at what the background is and how that can be sort of linking the two worlds together between consumers and brands. A lot of what I'll be talking about and what it is based on is the report that we have published in March this year. If you go to our website, you can download it there for free, and an update of the report has just gone online this morning on our blog with the latest reports that have become publicly available over the summer. So the reason actually for really looking at that in more depth is that repeatedly we've been asked, well, how can you square up the expectations that consumers have on the one hand and the in-house challenges with regards to sustainability that brands and manufacturers encounter on the one hand, and then also how can you bring together what seems to be opposite and how can you create opportunities out of that? So this is really what this webinar is all about. Now, if we look at the consumer and what we have learned through the research, what they are kind of looking for, on a first level, that is when you're talking to them, it is style when it comes to fashion, cheap prices, being recognized by peers, and the convenience of being able to buy where and when they want. Now, this is so far so good. You would say, well, that is probably nothing new to it. And as a matter of fact, that is pretty straightforward up to here. Where it gets a lot more interesting is when we start to dig into deeper layers of what they want and are often not able to express in first instance. And these are things like that they rely on word of mouth of their colleagues, of family, of friends, that they want to be good people, that they want to be good citizens, and that they're looking for support to be so. They're looking for durability in every sense of the word, so things that kind of attract their emotional attention, that stay with them, and that fulfill a specific need. But at the same time, they will also tell you that whatever information they encounter to cater to all those different desires that they have, that they're just plainly overwhelmed by the information they have. Now, the interesting thing further is the fact that if all of those boxes are ticked as a package, as an entire whole, this can justify a retail price increase of up to 20%, and that is actually quite relevant. It's relevant because of a number of reasons. For one, we know that in the 2000s, the retail price for apparel has come down considerably. In the UK, it's come down by the equivalent of 10%, in the US by about 8.5%, whereas, and here we only have the accurate data from the US, the rest of the goods has actually increased by over half in their retail pricing. It aligns, it's equally interesting to know that at the same time, or over the same course of time and until the present, polyester prices have peaked or are peaking. Cotton prices have been rising on average over the last 10 years. And this again is in as far interesting because we know that up to around between two-thirds and 70% of the cost price of an apparel product is usually based on the raw material price, and that again impacts the retail price. So the fact that you could potentially tack on to up to 20% more on your retail margin because all those boxes are ticked for the consumer actually means that those impacts that we see here in the slides might be remedied to some extent. But that's not all the reality. The reality is also the fact that when it comes to how consumers rely on feedback from their own social networks, and those social networks can be online, they can be offline, they become ever more important, and it also means that thanks to globalization, what is happening overseas is starting to get replicated again here. So I'll just take as an arbitrary example Inditex, where they have encountered an uphill struggle last year at some point when Greenpeace went into the public, and within the course of about a couple of weeks managed to get them to sign off the detox because they were facing retail losses in that time period. But at the same time, the company has been in and out of the news, not for what's happening overseas, but it's actually happening in front of their own doors in their own country. And it hasn't been very well perceived by consumers at all, and the lashback on that has been substantial. So again, it's like, why does that matter? Well, because consumer, they associate an image with that, they associate with it where they want to be associated with it. But then also are the hard market data, and the hard market data, just to get one example here, this is from the UK, the market segment, or the market share of people that choose very consciously what they are buying, has risen since the late 1990s, early 2000s, up until the present across all different areas of our everyday life. And while this data just stems from the UK, it is replicated in Germany, it is replicated in France, and it is replicated in the US as well. If you look on our blog post from this morning, there's further data specifically about the German market, where the most recent and deepest studies just been released over the summer. This all said, it's not a phenomenon that we observe in terms of market share, in terms of demands, in terms of requirements that is relevant for all markets. There's a very clear trend in the same way in China specifically, although the reason why that is the case is very, very different from what we see in old markets in Europe and the US. The phenomenon that is observable in China is the fact that, for instance, foreign brands command a price premium. And the reason for that is because the Chinese consumer thinks that foreign brands are more reliable, more correct, they're doing business in a more correct way than those brands that rely on their own Chinese government as being controlled. One example that it was in the food area is the milk scandal that started somewhere in late 2011, carried through to 2012. But out of fashion, where it is reflected quite interestingly, is a brand called Icicle that basically, in terms of market segment it caters to, is a middle to upper bourgeois city dweller, fairly high income market niche. They work primarily with European and Japanese fabric brands, and they absolutely make that part of their communications. And it is one of the reasons why the consumers buy into that brand, because they think they can guarantee quality in that way. Now, what does quality mean in that context? It is very clearly linked to health and safety, security and survival in a very primal way, if you want. To give you an examples in numbers, again, this example is from the milk scandal between 2008 and 2012. The prices for foreign branded milk powder goods have risen between 25 and 40%. And this in contrast to just about 8% where normal food prices have risen, and the only reason being the fact that the Chinese consumer thinks that because those brands are from overseas and hence they are being controlled by legislation and transparency requirements that are more stringent than their own, they're willing to pay the extra money for that. And for the income margin that we're looking at, a range of 25 to 40% is rather substantial. And that is not counting into the fact just yet that they, in many cases, have to travel quite far ways. Now, we also know that in the past, everything around sustainability in fashion, and specifically fashion ranges that have been specifically tagged as better, more sustainable, more ecological, or whatever you want to use in terms of vocabulary, hasn't been terrifically successful in a commercial way. And there are good reasons for that. Because if we ask consumers, one thing they absolutely abhor is being patronized. They don't want to be told that they have to be better. They don't want to be reminded that they generally don't buy ecological apparel or fashion. They don't want to be reminded that in general what is available at their fingertips doesn't tick certain responsibility boxes. But at the same time, it's equally been a problem of value for money, or rather a value versus price mismatch. So things like ethics is all nice and well, but when quality, style and durability doesn't factor in to sufficient levels, or if it's very, very clearly made for the huge masses, that doesn't justify a price that they're willing to pay. And obviously at the other end of that, it means that things like choice or ease of access or a compelling story, a pedigree, a coolness factor, that this is considered a value for money thing, and that is worth the money, or it is the value that is worth their money, and that they can rely on the facts being facts rather than just claims. Now the question obviously is, well, how can the two worlds of what is happening in corporates already in terms of sustainability, the efforts that are being done, the achievements that are very clearly achieved, and how can that kind of tie in with what consumers are expecting? And all of that starts, for today, in our conversation, we'll let it start at the communications bit.
So this is where I think our experience of working with customers to help them understand and communicate effectively their sustainability ambition really kicks off. One of the pieces of work we've done with several of our clients is helping them understand how to communicate their sustainability ambition, how to set out right from the start that they're on a journey together, and that what they want to do is be clear about how they're going. I think, as we'll talk about later on, we already know very well that a lot of customers, when they're presented with information that they can understand, will use that. But the first thing to do is to set out quite an effective communication strategy.
So that basically means you need to be able to build stories around what you do and how you do it.
That's absolutely right. And I think the first thing that we will look at in terms of that is, I think, the obvious one, which is looking at the operations and looking at what kind of data is available. And as you can see from the slide, that can be as simple as looking at the raw materials involved in the process, looking at what kind of data is available in terms of raw energy use, in terms of production, things like distribution networks and things like waste. These are all obvious bits of data that become available, and it's that first operational stage that gives you that. It helps you start to understand what kind of information you've got available to you.
And just to give you an example how that potentially could look like, this again, is like this is the user view, the consumer view if you want, so it's not ideal in that context. However, it gives a very, very good example of what is happening behind the scenes. And this is from an example from a client of ours, bestseller, and what you see here very clearly is like asking the questions, what do they do? And there are a number of things like you can see here, for instance, on the upper left corner, circled in red, there's buying practice, so there is something happening internally around that. There's something around cooperation that they seem to work on as well, and then very clearly things around that they work on chemical restriction lists, health and safety guidelines, genes guidelines. If you start digging further down, then it becomes very clear that all of those are the results of fairly fine-grained processes that have come into place over a range of time, that have been refined over a range of time, and that have been the result, or that are the result of an in-house research, if you want to find out how things are being done, how they should be done ideally, and hence to take that forward as their own best practice. Now out of that,
I think comes the next stage, which for us is reporting. So this is obviously where I think SustainIt have probably the most experience. We've worked with clients extensively on taking the data that's built through kind of the operational and the analysis stage, understanding the boundaries of what's happening within your business, and turning that into a reporting strategy. Obviously for us, the first one is measurement, and it's so important to get that right at the start, is understanding the kind of data that's available to you and being able to use that effectively. Being able to look and break down data, not just in terms of group numbers, but globally, by country, by business operation. For some of our clients, we've helped them to do that right down to a per product basis. Being able to communicate the extent of your impact in a scored, meaningful way to reporting is a great way to really build the idea that you aren't just doing a sustainable thing, you're becoming a sustainable business, and it's that transition that I think really plays a part. I think this is a really good example as well, is
Timberland. And for many that might not come as a surprise, but actually what they do and the way they allow people to have an insight into what's happening under their hood, the approach is actually quite interesting, because you see how far down actually you're allowed to dig, and that's not even internal data. This is data that is entirely available to the public. You can or not, depending on your own preference, start to dig down. This is stuff that is copied as is of their website. So you'll see in the upper right corner, this here is now displayed yearly. It might as well displayed in other formats, which is rather interesting to give people access in that way. But in terms of what they have available and make available to the public, and I'm sure there's a lot more in-house, it goes from climate, greenhouse gas emissions. In this example of a product, again, this is an example from their tannery and environmental performances. It goes on to data around factory and social working conditions. So again, this is percentage of factories unionized per region. Could be broken down in entirely, completely approaches. And finally, they look at their own company in the bigger picture, and this specifically is diversity data across their whole operations, and then broken down to just the US. And this again is in as far interesting because not only in terms of workforce that you attract, but also the type of consumer that we'll be looking at. Is the consumer thinking of you as a company that is like them, the products that are like the ones they really want to wear, or is it a company that's just for the others? So data like that certainly starts to allow you to ask those kind of questions and respond to what the image is that a consumer has of your company. And that gets us to close the loop, in a sense, because...
Yeah, so this is now the final stage. It's now taking everything from the dedication to customer through understanding the extent of your operations and into reporting, into actually now becoming part of the brand value. And I think this is really, as Pam says, where you close that circle. I've seen so many times where we've started this conversation with clients where it's been about, well, we just want to do a little bit about sustainability reporting. And you know right from the start that those projects aren't going to be quite as successful. It's when you sit down in a room and people say, right, we want to change the way that our brand is perceived. We want to become a more sustainable business. And that's really where the circle closes and you get the real advantage. One of the things that's really quite apparent for me is that at the moment, there's still no hard and fast rules about what a sustainable business is or what a sustainable business does. It's moving very fast in terms of legislative requirements, in terms of reporting guidelines. There's no real hard and fast rule across the world. It's very much about being able to set out your own path and being very honest about it. We know from the market research we do and that other people do that customers on the whole don't expect a perfect brand. They don't expect somebody to be absolutely perfect in terms of sustainability, in terms of their approach to it. And they don't expect them to be able to do that themselves. What they want to be able to do is make the right steps, to make the right choices with the brands that they use, with the customers that they have, with the relationships they have professionally. They want to make the right choices. And so for me, a big part of sustainability is about making sure that the companies that we work with are communicating effectively that they are making those right choices, that they're doing that little bit extra to make sure they're being more sustainable. And that's really how you close that circle off quite nicely.
And it makes a point that all those data, ultimately it's useless unless it's clearly aligned with the brand values that have the personality of who you are and how you talk. And that links back again to how to talk to customers and how customers look at you and what they expect of you. A good example of how that can align very, very neatly is a small brand from Northern Wales, a jeans brand. They don't do anything else but jeans. It's called High Denim. And the way they align what they do internally, both in terms of sustainability as much as in production, how they engage with what is their target audience of consumers, but also how they leverage the self-perception of their consumers together with their own achievements in production is quite unique, really. So on the one hand, they go for a very clear pedigree that is represented in limited numbers, in limited styles, in open door policies, and top quality that they deliver, but then at the same time they clearly engage with the consumers being allowed to experience and to create their own whole community. And this way of opening up what is happening under the hood has been hugely successful for them. This range of going across all the circle that we've just talked about has worked out really, really well. Which obviously asks or opens the question of, well, what are easy ways and good decisions to leverage what is being done already without it costing the earth and without it consuming internal resources, and yet leveraging what can be leveraged by talking to your customer.
So again, I think we should really focus on the operational side, as it's a really good first step for us in terms of defining what's available. And as the slide has just popped up rather well timed, it's all about baselines and issues. So it's about understanding where you are at the moment. It's about looking across the organization for what kind of data is available. It's about finding the stories within that data that allow you to begin to understand where you are in terms of spikes of information and holes in data, and allowing you to use those to make those easy wins. We've worked with several clients who've had large-scale operations brought in and had to re-baseline. And it's by understanding those baselines very clearly they've been able to have some quick wins in reaction to how those new parts of the business integrate. Again, being able to understand where you're stood gives you those easy first steps.
So in other words, it starts off with asking a question of, well, what is it that the consumer really wants to know from you? Building the story and then finding out what is the story behind it that you have in place and starting to fill gaps. So what do they want to know, but also what are you doing, who is doing it, how and where it's being done, and importantly, why is it done in the first place?
So I think as we move from baselines into reporting, then we move from the first question of what do you have into a very bigger question for us, and one I tend to get quite involved in with our clients, which is what do you need? Understanding how you can turn the data you've got and transform that into a reporting set that you can use, both for measurement in terms of setting targets on energy efficiency or waste reduction, in terms of creating scorecards for local factories or globally, and then for reporting. I think one of the important things to bear in mind when you start talking about reporting is it's not just about an external standard. I know at the moment we get a lot of questions about mandatory GHG reporting, but so many big customers now demand of their suppliers that they adhere to things like CDP or to EcoVadis or to SEDEX. These are all forms of reporting that you have to bear in mind when you start to look long and hard at what your sustainability strategy is going to be moving forward. It's understanding where you need to go will answer the questions of how you're going to get there.
And again, looking at what kind of question would be useful to guide in that sense is like it ultimately leads through again to what is it that you want to be telling and what is it that you can tell. So what are the facts? Who knows your facts? Where do they come from? How are they being generated? Why are they being generated? And what is the story that is behind them? What is the story that they're telling you? And what is the story that they will be telling to your consumers about your products, about you as a company? And in a sense, that obviously leads to the question, well, it's all nice and well, but what is then the difference between a better, more sustainable product and a company that is better in sustainability terms? And obviously, this is a good question we can discuss in all length and breadth, but for today and in this context, I would probably define it in the following way. A better product is a one-off in a sense. So it is, say for instance, a range of products made of recycled PET, but anything else that the company has doesn't comply with those standards. To be very specific, there's a brand called Billabong. They do exactly that. They have a range of recycled polyester products. That for me is a better product because the rest of the company doesn't quite align to that. Now, if you compare that with a company like Textile, for instance, they, for every product development they have, they basically go around this circle. And you can really start a circle off at any one point. So whether it is looking at what materials and what you're doing, or how you want to improve it, or how authentic or honestly or factual you want to be communicating, what kind of story you want to create, and how you want to talk to your consumers, that doesn't really matter where you start. But ultimately, they go exactly around this circle for every single thing that they do for every activity. And then it is, well, what is the way how to do that? And while none of that comes as an entire surprise, and I'm sure I'm not saying a lot of new things in this case, it ultimately is knowing where you're getting stuff actually into being done, and the things that work well, finding them and applying them consistently, rather than inventing the wheel from scratch. And find those people in-house as much as amongst your consumer, very importantly, that align, that have the same vision as you, that are basically the brand, that can walk the talk and do want to talk it. And all the rest really is something that comes with it and is part of, once you start doing or heading towards better products and more sustainable products, comes as a natural part of the process. Of course, there has to be CEO buy-in. Of course, there has to be an embedded in a corporate culture. We all know that. It is about actually getting it done. The same for building the understanding is, well, who reads your story? Who hears your story? Is it the consumer? Is it your neighbor on the desk? Or is it the people downstairs on the shipping floor? But ultimately, it's that. Are the story you create, is it compelling? Is it backed up? Does it tell what you want to do and how you're doing it? And is it believable? And the way this actually has been done is quite interesting to see. Is Puma a couple of 3 years ago started to engage with their designers very specifically about changing that and thinking, well, how could they do things differently? And what they came up with is 50 ways of thinking and doing sustainable design. So they started doing and breaking things down in whether it's materials, whether it's chemistry, whether it's finishing, whether it's labor, whether it's the research that is being done. 50 different ways of how they could triangulate the problem of integrating sustainability into their design process in a new and more innovative way. And what came out of it is this, just as an example. It's still a shoebox, it's still the same shoe. It's got a lot less cardboard to their shoebox. It's got a bag instead of a covering cardboard. It's reduced the weight, it's reduced the cardboard amount. They managed to add value for their customers, because now the customers got actually a bag to carry the sneakers in, which they always wanted and never had. And in a similar way, for their quite famous "I'm half the bag I used to be" t-shirt, which is exactly the same t-shirt initially. In the first go, it's changed now, but initially it was this very same t-shirt folded in half. It looked more pretty for the consumer. It saved them half the package. They could ship twice as many t-shirts from production to the sales market. And while it is small improvements in terms of where the improvement happened at the very initial of the design cycle, it was and it remains quite innovative, really. So to conclude up to here at this moment, it is that in, I would say, less than 5 years, consumers have gone from sort of the alternative militant, I don't buy anything other than organic cotton t-shirts produced in small communities, to a fairly mainstream discussion. It's a mainstream discussion not only because of what happened in Bangladesh, but a discussion that started to mainstream considerably before that. And by now is certainly as a conversation topic at the very least to be found in any group of people you care to talk to. This is partially certainly due to globalization, in the sense of what digital media have done to how consumers communicate amongst them, but also communicate with brands, with companies, even with manufacturers in some cases. But it has also given rise to a reaction or an opportunity to react to the cynicism that consumers have voiced possibly over decades, which has led just for many of them not believing any claims that have been brought forward by companies, which by now we can actually bring forward data that shows that whatever is done within a brand, a company, actually coincides with hard facts. So to quickly loop back to the beginning, what is a better consumer? We said in the beginning is one that seems to have paradox characteristics that go back and forth between fairly shallow, stylish, cheap prices, peer recognition, convenience thing, to wanting to be better, looking for durable goods, relying on word of mouth, and completely being overwhelmed by information. If we start now, however, to dig down into that, what is it that they really, really want? What are those intrinsic motivations that consumers react to and that they want to be catered to, that need to be catered to, certainly in apparel, but not only in apparel? And if we start digging into that, it is within society that consumers want recognition. They want to have a good standard of life, and they value individual freedom and choice. And when we start to zoom into that, into what they really want from their peer group and family, then it is things like acceptance, respect, and support. Company being loved, to put it a bit more, to put in a soft value. And then further down, still as an entire individual, they want to be proud of who they are. They want the truth of themselves, and they want to have freedom of choice. So they don't want to be told what they're supposed to be doing. And all of that has a reflection at the brand, retail, and production level. At the brand level, that means they want to be able to identify with a brand, that they're looking for a brand that has pedigree. And what does pedigree mean in this place? It means a brand that has been around for a while, that has proven to be quality, that has proven to be quality also as a brand, as in how the brand works, how it exists, how its history has evolved, and the kind of policy a brand has with and through their products. That does not mean that they're, straight away are willing to pay premium prices. So yes, they are looking for, to some extent, cheap prices, whatever that means in the context. They want it to be convenient. Again, what does this exactly mean? It's not quite clear at this stage yet. And they want stories, they want information, they want truth, but not too much of it. And finally, what is it when we zoom in right down to the individual product? Well, it's what I said in the very introduction. It's value for money. So yes, cheap, but it's not just price. It's what do you get actually for the money that you leave on the counter? What is the story that the product has to tell, and is it a product that really aligns with them as a real individual? So rather than having this circle that we had in the beginning, which revolves around a number of sometimes very paradox and clashing values, it's more something like that. So the whole thing revolves around the consumer self-image, where cool style rather is a thing about their style. Rather than to be good, they want to be proud of themselves. Rather than to have cheap stuff, they want to have value for money. They want to be accepted or respected by peers. And it's things like that that show that there is a very, very clear possibility and potential to use a sustainability credential in that, because if they want to be proud, well, they're certainly not going to be proud buying a brand they know and consciously have to ignore where it's being produced and what circumstances. That doesn't mean that they want to be slapped with, say, social or environmental criteria at every single step of their path, but they want to be confident that what they do is the right way, and every single step that gets them closer to be allowed to be proud and to be allowed to be a good person will certainly be appreciated by them.
Okay, so the last thing to talk about then is the established expertise of what we do and how we work together. So I think, and we've got quite an obvious slide here, so from our perspective and from what SustainIt can add to these discussions, as you can see, we're not from the sustainable textiles, sustainable fashion industry. We work with sustainability as a whole, so our expertise really is cross-industry. We work with data, and we work with large corporates to help them understand their information, to use that information effectively as a tool for engaging their customers, for a tool for helping their customers understand what they're doing and how they're approaching sustainability. And that can be both internal and external customers. I think that's an important point to make. We help our clients understand their sustainability ambitions and put data around that will allow them to report effectively beyond just a spreadsheet of numbers. We help it become something understandable and usable.
And in the same sense, texture works on, so to speak, the other spectrum. We're really only very focused only on textiles and fashion apparel. That's what we're expert in. What we are expert in are the actual processes and the strategy of the business. So where does the business have to be, want to be, within a few years, on the long run, what is the vision that backs up whatever you will be doing in operations. And as you've seen in this webinar, when it comes specifically to the consumer, who's the ultimate driver for whatever a business does, the data side and the vision side and the storytelling side are really very intrinsically linked. Right, thank you very much for listening up to here. I'm opening now the floor to questions. As a matter of fact, I've already had a first question that's been posted to us actually before the talk even. I'm reading it out just now. It says, looking at, hang on. So looking at how retailers can ensure that they are being compliant in regard to their supply chain. Part of the challenge lies in the lack of a harmonized approach to sustainability, audits, reporting, and even a clear consensus as to what the term sustainability encompasses. Government and trade bodies do not have that high enough on their agenda, despite bodies such as DEFRA in the UK having conducted their sustainability roadmap. So what is our take from the organizing team of this webinar towards that? I mean, there's several things to be said around that. It's certainly true that in terms of harmonizing approaches to sustainability, there's a lack of coordination in all different ways. Currently, there's a massive discussion going on around what is called an audit fatigue, the fact that a lot of suppliers have to cope with repeat audits for the same thing by different brands that send in their own audit teams. So this is very clearly a problem. Whether it's government and trade bodies to be responsible for that, or whether it is interest organizations that come out of collaborations of businesses, I think this is a question that remains open. On a very personal note, I would think the most appropriate would be organizations that have already come into place, in a sense, and exactly following that, say the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, that in essence follows precisely that point and that strategy. There's something to be said about government and trade bodies, but ultimately whatever comes into place from government is legislation. Legislation tends to be the lowest common denominator rather than the best practice approach to it. So where to start off and how to take it, what is the quickest way how to do it, despite the length of time it takes, probably the quickest way actually is collaboration between brands. The way we see it in the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, the way we see it with the Bangladesh Accord, it's full of hurdles, it's difficult to do, but it probably is the most effective way, at least up to now, and what it has been done up until the present. But yes, I agree, there is a severe disalignment in terms of harmonized approach, and pretty much in every sense of the word that this can mean, whether it's from a government perspective, from a business perspective, or from a trade body or NGO perspective, for that matter.
I think from my perspective, just to kind of, I think for the most part, agree really with what Pamela said. I think because we've got a much broader view in terms of the industries, we see this quite repeatedly, and I think audit fatigue is quite an interesting challenge. We work with clients who have to repeatedly, from different suppliers, complete forms based around things like carbon disclosure products, or through SEDEX, or through EcoVadis. I think it is happening more and more often. There is now, I think, and it's probably coming a little bit late for some of these guys, push back saying, well, hang on, we're not going to complete your survey. What we've done is we've signed up to SEDEX, EcoVadis, and CDP. You can have a look at our responses there, and that will give you all the information. Obviously, with GRI moving to their new framework, I think some of that adds some value for potential customers to look at their supply chain and understand what's going on. But on the whole, I think, and this is what part of what was asked, is what are the kind of the boundaries of sustainability? I think what's quite interesting from my perspective is we are now moving into almost a post-carbon world, which is quite a way of putting it, I think. But it was, for the first 2 years that I was involved in this industry, very much about nothing but CO2 footprint, and that was what everybody cared about. but I think with things like Bangladesh happening, it's not, that focus has shifted, and really in the last 12 months, shifted quite dramatically. There's a lot more interest now on working conditions, on social activities, on a company being not just an environmentally friendly company wherever possible, but on being a truly sustainable company. And therein lies a big challenge in terms of data, because it's no longer just about the numbers of how much energy you produce, how much waste you use. It's about something much wider. And that's really where it's going to be companies who want to say, put their hand up and say, no, we're leading the way, that will really drive what sustainability is. Okay, so if there are any more questions, if you use the chat functionality, and that should then type in and pop up.
Great, I already got a question that came through. It says, do you think consumers are currently educated, aware enough of sustainability and ethics, or is there still a long way to go? I guess my answer would be a clear yes and no at once. I guess it depends what threshold you put at what means being educated and aware and enough. And it's not that they don't know anything at all. It's like they know that there are issues around, say, labor conditions. They know that there are issues around raw materials in cotton, and the way, for instance, cotton is grown, or the way cotton is harvested, or the issues around polyester as being a side effect of being an oil-based material ultimately. So there is a good degree of awareness there. Now, how deep that awareness goes and how complex the answer is they have to different issues, that is an entirely different story. So if you wanted to start to make a point about second, third, and fourth level tier of suppliers and the complexities that come out of that, and the problems around audits, and why it still could happen that they, even though you've got a very good handle on your supply chain, you still might end up being involved in the scandal earlier this year in Bangladesh, because they sometimes happen despite. This is a point that is a lot more difficult to make. It is difficult to make sometimes even for people who have been a long time in the industry, and I have talked to certainly a French retailer who have a very, or to be specific, that have a very tight control on what they're doing with their own products, and they found themselves involved in having products being produced in Bangladesh in the factory that caved in, and that despite all the control. So how do you explain that to a consumer plausibly? Difficult. So yes, they do know a fair amount of things. They are fairly aware, but they're not aware to the point where it starts getting into the ins and outs of how the industry works. There is another question that I've just been pitched. Is there a typical age group for the better consumer according to your research? Actually, it's interesting to look at that specifically in sight of the German research that came out last summer by the Otto Group themselves, which shows that there actually isn't. But in terms of age range, it tends to be the younger the people, the more readily they are willing to pay for better products, and the older the people are, the less that is the case. So it looks like as we grow older, I would say the fronts are probably a bit more divided. So you will probably still have those that are very clearly willing to pay more, or that are very clearly only or targeting and really looking at how they can buy and consume better, and then those that just stopped caring altogether. Whereas for younger age groups, they're not only more willing to do that, but overall seem to be a bit more, I would say, engaged into and open to buy better on a general level.
Yeah, I think again I would. Again, the research that we see and the work that I've just been cut off.
Voila. Okay, so it seems that Joe's just been cut off accidentally. So let me see if he's getting back in, because okay, he's dialing back in. So I think the point he wanted to make is really it depends a bit also in what kind of industries you look at when it comes to what a better consumer is. I mean, fashion has its very peculiar way of looking at, and food, for instance, would behave in a yet different way.
Yes, I'm back. Sorry for that. I think one of the things that we see quite a lot is research on what's probably termed as millennials. I think this ties into that. An awful lot of young people now, not just in terms of fashion and textiles, but in terms of their whole lifestyle, are looking to take a more sustainable approach, right away from the product they buy all the way through to the companies they work for. I saw a great piece of research last year that suggested a graduate today will be willing to work for up to £10,000 a year less as a middle manager if the company they're working for is aligned with its sustainability or ethics, for want of a better. Really now isn't just a case of it being a nice to have for these young people today. They understand the potential impact and they really want to get involved with it.
Yeah, so are there any further questions that you would like us to ask? Please do put them into chat. We'd be happy to answer them. Otherwise, I mean, so by all means, do get to us by email. You've been in touch with either Elsa or myself, so you do feel free to send us any follow-up questions you might have. We're definitely going to be happy to answer them for us as good and as accurately as we can. So if there are not any more questions at this stage, I once again would like to say thank you for your attendance.
I'll pick it up again and say that's also from our perspective. I think this is the first in a season of webinars and pieces of work with texture. We're quite excited about the marrying between our expertise on data and texture's expertise in both in the industry and gaining real understanding of the market.
Absolutely. Absolutely, I would certainly sign up to that right away myself. So thank you very much. In particular, there are a couple of people from overseas, I see, so thank you for the late time in your day. I hope you have a good rest of the day, and thank you very much, and goodbye.